So this underwater supervolcano just blew. What happens now? A massive underwater volcano eruption has just occurred. You can watch the steam coming out of the water as it makes its way to the surface. And once it reaches the top, a plume of smoke billows into the air. But that's not the interesting part. No, sir. The really cool thing about this event is that it happened beneath the ocean. But why do we even care if a volcano erupts underwater? I mean, there aren't any people down there except for those crazy submarine dwellers who probably won't be bothered at all by some minor volcanic activity. Well, believe it or not, what happens when an underwater volcano erupts can affect almost everybody on the planet. The reason that underwater volcanoes are so potentially dangerous is that they can cause tsunamis, giant destructive waves that can travel across the ocean and wreak havoc on everything in their path. That's why it's so important to understand what exactly happens when an underwater volcano blows its lid. And fortunately for you, dear viewer, I happen to know exactly what would happen. See, our first step to understanding what happens when an underwater volcano erupts is understanding how volcanoes work in general. The basic idea is pretty simple. Deep within the earth, molten rock known as magma is constantly churning away. As it rises up through the cracks and weak points in the Earth's crust, it collects in magma chambers. Eventually, the pressure in these chambers becomes too much for the rocks above them to withstand, and the magma erupts as lava, ash, and gases, depending on the volcano. These eruptions can be relatively gentle affairs or catastrophic events that destroy everything nearby. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, obviously, but what does this have to do with underwater volcanoes? Well, the same basic principles apply, except that instead of magma chambers, we have magma oceans. Instead of lava flows, we have lava lakes. And instead of the occasional small eruption, we get these enormous explosions that dwarf anything that happens on land. So basically, it's the same, only more extreme. Take, for example, the Loki P eruption, which occurred near the island of Surtsey in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean in 1984. It's considered to be the largest volcanic eruption of the 20th century. Over the course of 2 days, it spewed around 600 million cubic meters of lava into the sea. In fact, the amount of lava erupted during this time was so great that it actually added new land to the island. New islands formed by underwater volcanic activity are actually fairly common. For example, Surtsey itself was created by a series of eruptions in the late 1960s. Prior to then, there was no dry land where it now sits. Now, in the case of the Loki P eruption, the lava didn't spill over the sides of the crater and flow onto the surrounding land. Instead, it built up inside the crater until it overflowed and spilled into the sea. Once in the ocean, the lava quickly hardened into a new island, which is still there today. But that's not what most underwater volcanoes do. Most underwater volcanoes don't add new land to the ocean floor. They simply spill their lava out into the surrounding waters, creating massive lava flows that spread out over hundreds of square miles. Now, you might be wondering what happens to these lava flows once they hit the water. Does the lava just sit there as a big hot blob in the middle of the ocean? Well, yes and no. On the one hand, the lava does form a blob in the ocean, but it doesn't stay hot for long. Hot-flowing lava is typically around 1000 degrees Celsius, but water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. So once the lava hits the water, it immediately begins to cool and harden. In fact, within seconds, it cools enough that it forms a solid crust. On the other hand, the lava doesn't just sit there. The cooling process causes dissolved gases in the lava to expand, which creates enormous amounts of pressure. This pressure is so great that it often causes the crust to shatter, which allows more lava to flow out and harden, and the cycle begins anew. Over time, the fragmented crust forms a thick pile of jagged black rock known as pillow basalt. Pillow basalt gets its name from its distinctive appearance, which is caused by the rapid cooling and contraction of the lava. It looks kind of like a bunch of pillows piled up next to each other. But don't be fooled by its name. Pillow basalt is extremely dangerous. The sharp edges and corners of the rock can easily slice through a boat or damage a ship's propeller, making it impossible to move. But all this rock is nothing compared to what happens when an underwater volcano erupts explosively. Explosive eruptions are significantly more dangerous than non-explosive ones, because they can send huge amounts of debris and energy surging through the water. These underwater volcanic eruptions are also known as caldera-forming eruptions, which is a fancy way of saying that they make big holes in the ocean floor. To better understand what happens during a caldera-forming eruption, let's take a look at what happened in 1912, when the Spanish island of La Palma last erupted. At the time, scientists were keeping tabs on the volcano as it rumbled back to life. They knew that an eruption was imminent, but they had no idea that it would be the largest eruption in the history of the Canary Islands. The eruption began on September 6, 1912, and lasted for over a week. During that time, the Cumbre Vieja volcano ejected more than 5 billion cubic meters of material, including solid rock fragments, ash, and gases. The resulting collapse of the magma chamber left a massive crater in its wake, which is now home to a lake of toxic volcanic mud. The energy released during this eruption was equivalent to about 650 megatons of TNT, which is roughly 30 times the amount of explosives used during the entire span of World War II. To put that amount of energy into context, in 1980, Mount St. Helens erupted with a force of 5 megatons of TNT. By comparison, the 1912 La Palma eruption was nearly 130 times greater than that. So needless to say, if something like that were to happen today, it would cause absolute chaos. As it stands, though, it hasn't been totally disastrous. Yes, the 1912 eruption devastated the local area, destroying thousands of homes and killing hundreds of livestock. However, aside from the physical destruction, the tsunami that accompanied the eruption didn't end up being very harmful. Scientists believe that this was due to the shape of the island, which acted as a sort of barrier, protecting the coast from the worst of the wave. Unfortunately, if something similar were to happen today, the results could be catastrophic. That's because many coastal communities rely on ports and harbors, things that would be destroyed by even a moderately sized tsunami. For example, in Japan, the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami disaster caused widespread devastation along the coast. The giant wave that followed the earthquake reached heights of up to 40 meters, wiping out everything in its path. More than 60,000 people had to be evacuated, and thousands of buildings and roads were destroyed. And that was just from a regular old earthquake. An underwater volcanic eruption could have a much worse outcome. In fact, researchers estimate that an eruption in the wrong location could potentially cause a wave more than 100 meters high. Waves of that size could inundate entire island chains, wipe out coastal cities, and devastate important shipping lanes. That's why monitoring underwater volcanoes is so important. If we can keep track of their activity, we might be able to predict future eruptions and hopefully mitigate some of the damage. Of course, this isn't easy to do because, well, they're underwater. It's not like we can just stick a thermometer in there to see how hot it is. But luckily, scientists have come up with a few clever ways to monitor these underwater giants. For example, sonar is a great tool for measuring changes in the shape of the ocean floor. By bouncing sound waves off the ocean floor, scientists can create maps of the seafloor and look for signs of new volcanic activity. They can also use satellites to track changes in the surface of the ocean. When an underwater volcano erupts, the water level in the surrounding area can rise significantly. Satellites are able to measure these changes in water level, which can give scientists an early warning sign of an eruption. But perhaps the most exciting development in the field of underwater volcano monitoring is the use of unmanned submersibles. These robots are able to explore the depths of the ocean without putting human divers at risk. They can take measurements, collect samples, and even take videos. One day they might even be able to detect the early signs of an underwater eruption and alert scientists in time to prevent a major disaster. Okay, but let's be honest. None of us are really worried about a random underwater volcano blowing up. There are far more pressing issues facing humanity right now. Yeah, sure, an underwater volcano could hypothetically cause a devastating tsunami, but what are the odds of that happening anytime soon? Well, Thanks to modern monitoring technology, the odds of a deadly underwater volcanic eruption are actually quite low. In fact, there's only ever been one confirmed death caused by an underwater volcano. That was back in 1980, when a young woman named Erica Storm was killed by pyroclastic flows while trying to visit the site of Mount St. Helens eruption. So while underwater volcanoes may not be at the top of our collective list of concerns, it's still important to be aware of the risks they pose. After all, you never know when a giant wave might come crashing ashore. And who would you rather be caught off guard by? A monster wave or a giant space laser? See you next time.